What if the most powerful king in Europe, the Sun King himself, Louis XIV, had an identical twin brother, born just moments before him, a brother whose very existence threatened the throne of France? What if that twin was secretly imprisoned for life, his face forever hidden behind a mask of iron, so that no one would ever know the terrible truth locked away in the darkest dungeons of the realm? And what if, even today, the royal houses of Europe still whisper that the official story is a lie, and the real secret is far more shocking than anyone dares admit? If you want to uncover the forbidden truths that history tried to bury, subscribe now to History 1 and never miss the next revelation. Now, dim the lights, lean in close, and let me take you back to the glittering, treacherous court of Versailles, where a single birth would change the fate of a kingdom forever. The year was 1638. In the royal chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, just outside Paris, Queen Anne of Austria had been married to King Louis XIV for 23 painful years without producing an heir. France teetered on the brink of chaos. Then, miraculously, after countless prayers and pilgrimages, the Queen felt the first pains of labour on the evening of 5th September. The midwives worked through the night. Courtiers crowded the corridors, whispering that God had finally smiled on the House of Bourbon. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a healthy boy was born. Bells rang out across Paris, bonfires were lit, the Dauphin had arrived. They named him Louis Dieudonné, Louis the God-given. But the labour did not end. Half an hour later, to the stunned silence of the birthing chamber, a second cry echoed through the blood-scented room. Another boy. Identical. Perfect. A twin. The chief midwife, a woman loyal to the Queen for decades, stared in horror at the two infants lying side by side. The first had been born at the stroke of 10, the second at past. 30 minutes separated them, 30 minutes that made one child the future King of France, and the other a living danger. In the law of primogeniture, even a minute could decide the crown. A twin-born second could never claim precedence. Yet the resemblance was uncanny. Same dark eyes, same delicate Bourbon nose. If the truth ever leaked, pretenders would rise. Civil war could tear the kingdom apart just as it had a generation earlier. Cardinal Richelieu, the real power behind the throne, was summoned at once. The king himself, weak and melancholic, was not even told the full story. Richelieu took one look at the second child and made the decision that would haunt France for a century. Only one Dauphin can exist, he whispered to the Queen. The other must vanish, quietly, completely, forever. Anne of Austria wept, but she was a Habsburg princess first and a mother second. She understood the stakes. She kissed the second boy once, pressed a tiny gold cross into his swaddling clothes, and turned away. That very night, under cover of darkness, the infant was smuggled out of Saint-Germain in the arms of a trusted nurse. He was taken to a remote estate in the provinces and registered simply as Philippe, son of a minor noble captain killed in battle. No one outside a handful of people ever knew he had been born a prince. The official records of the birth were altered. Witnesses were pensioned off, exiled, or quietly eliminated. France rejoiced over its single miracle child, the future Louis XIV, but secrets, like bodies buried in shallow graves, have a way of refusing to stay dead. For 20 years, the boy called Philippe grew up believing he was the orphan of a cavalry officer. He was raised in gentle obscurity on a modest estate near the Loire, taught to ride, to fence, to read Latin and dance the minuet. His guardians were kind but distant, and whenever he asked about his parents, the answers grew vague. He had his mother's dark eyes, they said. He looked nothing like his supposed father. What he never knew was that every mirror in the house had been removed the day he arrived. Servants were forbidden to let him see his own reflection beside any visiting noble who might recognize the impossible truth. In 1658, when Philippe was 20, a royal courier arrived with sealed orders. The young man was summoned to Paris for the king's service. He rode north, excited, dreaming of a commission in the musketeers. Instead, he was taken at night to the Bastille. The governor himself, a trembling man, read the lettre de cachet signed by the king's own hand. Philippe laughed at first, thinking it a mistake. Then the irons were clamped on his wrists. He was transferred in a closed coach to the fortress of Pignerol in the Alps, far from any road. There, in a cell high in the mountain keep, he met his new jailer. a stern, silent officer named Benin d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars, who had guarded Cardinal Richelieu's most dangerous enemies. On the day the cell door slammed shut, Saint-Mars placed something cold and heavy over Philippe's head. It was not the crude iron mask of legend, but a finely crafted visor of black velvet lined with steel plates, locked at the back with a silver padlock. Springs allowed the jaw to move just enough to eat, but no one would ever see his face again. "You will wear this always," Saint-Mars said, voice flat. "If you remove it, you die. If anyone sees what is beneath, they die. If you speak your true name, both of you die." Philippe screamed until his throat bled. Then he wept. Then he sat in the darkness and listened to the wind howl through the arrow slits, wondering what crime he'd committed before he was even born. Meanwhile, in Paris, the Sun King was rising. Louis XIV, tall, handsome, and already conscious of his divine destiny, took personal power in 1661 upon the death of Cardinal Mazarin. He built Versailles, he tamed the nobility, he fought wars that redrew the map of Europe, and he never once mentioned that somewhere, locked away in the mountains, lived a man who could pass for his mirror image. But the twin did not vanish from the world as cleanly as Richelieu had planned. Rumours began to creep along the corridors of power like smoke under a door. A laundress at Pignerol noticed that the prisoner's linen was marked with the royal fleur-de-lis. A surgeon called to treat a fever saw the man's shoulders and exclaimed that they were the exact match of the king's. The whispers reached Versailles. Foreign ambassadors wrote coded dispatches home. "They say His Majesty has a brother imprisoned." Louis grew furious. In 1669 he ordered Saint-Mars to move the prisoner to the remote island fortress of Sainte-Marguerite, off the coast of Cannes. The transfer was carried out with obsessive secrecy. The masked man was carried in a litter covered with oilcloth. Musketeers rode with pistols cocked, ordered to shoot anyone who tried to approach. At Sainte-Marguerite, the prisoner was given a new cell with a view of the sea he could never reach. Saint-Mars, now promoted for his discretion, dined with him every evening, the only human contact allowed. Over the years, a strange bond grew between captor and captive. The jailer began to call him Mon Prince when no one else could hear, and the prisoner began to speak. Not of escape, he had long since abandoned that dream, but of memory. He remembered the smell of the birthing chamber. He remembered a woman's tears on his infant face. He remembered a gold cross pressed into his hand. Saint-Mars listened, pale, and burned every letter he was ordered to write, summarising the conversations. By 1687, the whispers had become too loud. Louis ordered another transfer, this time to the Bastille itself, in the heart of Paris. The masked prisoner arrived at dusk on 18th of September, carried in a chair sealed with wax and curtains. The governor de Launay was told only that the prisoner must never be seen, never be spoken to by anyone but Saint-Mars himself. In the Bastille, the man in the mask was given the tower room once occupied by Fouquet, the disgraced finance minister. From his narrow window he could see the rooftops of Paris and, on clear days, the distant glint of Versailles. He was treated almost like royalty, fine food, books, even a harpsichord. But the mask never came off, and then, one spring evening in 1694, a new junior guard named Etienne Rosage made a terrible mistake. He climbed the stairs with the prisoner's supper and hearing music paused to listen. The prisoner was playing a slow, heartbreaking pavane. Rosages, moved by curiosity and the beauty of the melody, peered through the Judas hole. For one instant the masked man lifted the lower part of the visor to drink, and Rosages saw the face beneath. He dropped the tray, plates shattered. The man in the mask froze. Saint-Mars burst in, sword drawn. Rosages was dragged away that same night. 3 days later, his body was found floating in the Seine, throat cut, officially a suicide. But Rosages had already whispered what he saw to a fellow guard. Within a month, half of Paris was murmuring that the prisoner in the iron mask was the king's own brother. The secret was cracking open. The year 1698 arrived like a storm gathering over the Ile-de-France. Versailles glittered more brightly than ever, but beneath the gold and the mirrors, fear was spreading. Pamphlets, those poisonous little sheets printed in Holland and smuggled across the border, began to appear in the cafes of the Palais Royal. One bore a crude woodcut of a man in a mask and the caption, "He has the face of a god and the name of a ghost. Ask your king why he hides his own blood." Louis read them in private, his long fingers crushing the paper. He summoned the lieutenant of police, Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, the man who had cleaned Paris of poisoners and sorcerers. "Find the printers," the king said, voice soft as silk over steel. "Find the writers. Find anyone who speaks the word twin. I want tongues cut out and hands broken." La Reynie bowed and went to work. Presses were smashed. One Dutch printer was kidnapped from Amsterdam and vanished into the Châtelet. Yet the more blood flowed, the louder the whispers grew. In the Bastille, the prisoner sensed the change. Fewer guards now dared to climb the narrow stairs to the Tour de la Liberté. When they did, they crossed themselves. Some slipped extra wine into his supper, as though feeding a condemned saint. The man in the mask spent long hours at his window, watching the lanterns of Paris flicker like 1,000 accusing eyes. He began to write. Not letters, those were taken and burned, but on the blank margins of the books Sainte-Marguerite allowed him. In tiny, perfect handwriting he recorded fragments: the smell of lavender from the gardens of Saint-Germain, the weight of a woman's hand on his brow, the exact shade of blue of a ribbon tied around his wrist the day he was carried away. He wrote in Latin, then in cipher, then in a private code of musical notation. He knew no one would ever read it, but the act of remembering was the last freedom left to him. One night in the autumn of 1703, Sainte-Marguerite entered the cell, white-faced, carrying a single candle. The old jailer was 65 now, stooped, his eyes red from weeping. "It is finished, mon prince," he said, using the forbidden title openly for the first time. "His Majesty has decided. You are to be moved again, permanently, beyond even my reach." The prisoner lifted his masked head. "Where?" Sainte-Marguerite could not meet his eyes. "They did not tell me the name, only that the sea is wide and the walls are thick." The prisoner laughed then, a low, broken sound that made the candle flame tremble. After all these years, Louis is still afraid of a shadow. On 19th November 1703, in the hour before dawn, a closed sedan chair was carried out of the Bastille's postern gate. 6 musketeers of the Black Company walked beside it, hands on swords. The chair was taken to an unmarked coach waiting on the Rue Saint-Antoine. The coach rolled north, then west, then south, changing horses at lonely post houses where no questions were asked. The journey lasted 11 days. At last, the coach halted at a desolate fortress on a rock in the Atlantic, a place so secret that even its name was rarely spoken aloud. The fortress of Ile Sainte-Marguerite had been too close to the world. Now the prisoner was sent to a newer, grimmer prison, the citadel of Mont Saint-Michel, where the tides themselves seemed to guard the gates. But the man in the mask never arrived. Somewhere on the windswept road between locks and the coast, the coach stopped at a lonely crossroads. Sainte-Marguerite stepped down, opened the door, and did something no chronicle ever dared record. He unlocked the silver padlock at the back of the mask. For the first time in 34 years, moonlight fell on the prisoner's face. What happened next remains one of the great silences of history. Some say Sainte-Marguerite wept and embraced the prince like a brother. Some say he drew a pistol and put a ball through the heart of the living proof of Bourbon cruelty. Some say the prisoner simply walked away into the forest, mask in hand, and was never seen again. All that is certain is this. The official register of the Bastille records that on 19th November 1703, the masked prisoner died of a sudden apoplexy and was buried under the name Martioli. A cipher, a mockery, a final lie. Sainte-Marguerite returned to Paris alone. 3 months later he was dead. Poison, they said, though the king ordered no investigation. And Louis XIV, the Sun King, lived on for another 12 years, growing old beneath the weight of a crown that suddenly seemed too heavy. But the story did not die with them. Years passed. Versailles turned like a gilded music box, slow and relentless. Louis grew frail, his legs swollen with gout, his once godlike face sagging into heavy jowls. Courtiers who had trembled at his glance now pitied him. In the candlelit galleries, the old whispered to the young about the ghost that walked the kingdom, the man who had worn the mask, the prince who had never been. Then, in the spring of 1711, a thin, sun-browned stranger appeared at the gates of Versailles. He wore the rough coat of a Breton sailor and carried a sealed oilskin packet tied with faded blue ribbon, the same shade, some later swore, as the infant ribbon remembered in the margins of forbidden books. The stranger asked to see Madame de Ventadour, the aging governess who had once rocked the infant Dauphin in her arms. The guards laughed and turned him away, but not before the Duchess de Ventadour herself glimpsed him from a window. She went white as chalk, crossed herself, and fainted dead away. That night the stranger vanished as silently as he'd come. But the packet was found there, next morning on the high altar of the palace chapel, placed there by a hand no one had seen. Inside were 30 pages torn from prayer books and psalters, covered in the same tiny, perfect handwriting that Sainte-Mars had once burned. The pages told the story we have followed, the birth at Saint-Germain, the midnight theft, the decades behind the mask. At the bottom of the last sheet, in fresh ink still smelling of oak galls, was a single line. I lived. I forgave. I watched. No signature, only a small drawing, a fleur-de-lis crossed out with a single angry stroke, and beneath it the crude outline of an iron mask split in two. The king read the pages alone in the cabinet du conseil. When he emerged, his hand shook so violently that the Marquis de Dangeau had to steady the royal seal. Louis ordered every sheet burned in the great marble fireplace, and the ashes scattered into the Grand Canal. Then he summoned his confessor and remained on his knees for 6 hours. 4 years later, on 1st September 1715, the Sun King died after a reign of 72 years, the longest in European history. As the candles were snuffed one by one in the bedchamber, the old monarch is said to have whispered a name no one recognised. Philippe, forgive me. The regency began. Philippe d'Orléans, the late king's nephew, took power with a smile and a shrug. He opened windows, pardoned exiles, and turned Versailles into a pleasure ground. But even he, the most cynical man in France, never laughed when the masked prisoner was mentioned. In the cafes of Paris, the story grew wings. Voltaire, barely 20, heard it from an ancient musketeer who claimed to have guarded the clothes coach in 1703. Years later, when Voltaire himself was locked in the Bastille for his verses, he scratched on the wall of his cell. The mask was iron, but the crime was gold. Across the Channel, British pamphleteers seized the tale. In smoky London coffee houses, men argued whether the prisoner had been the king's twin, or an illegitimate son of Anne of Austria and the Duke of Buckingham, or even, absurdly, Oliver Cromwell in disguise. Every version sold 1,000 copies. But the deepest secret, the one no pamphlet ever printed, was kept by the House of Bourbon itself. In the private archives at Versailles, sealed with black wax and the Spanish arms of Anne of Austria, lies a single leather folder. It was placed there in 1775 by Louis XVI, a gentle, hesitant king who believed in truth the way other men believe in God. Inside are the original birth registers of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, registers that record not one but 2 male children born to the Queen on 5th September 1638. Beside the second entry, in the faded ink of a terrified clerk, someone has written, "Taken by order of His Eminence Cardinal Richelieu, may God have mercy on us all." The folder has never been opened in public, even during the Revolution, when mobs tore the palace apart searching for proof of royal crimes. The folder remained untouched, moved, some say, by a trembling archivist who understood that certain truths are more dangerous than any guillotine, and so the question lingers, like candle smoke in a cathedral long after the flame is out. Was the man in the iron mask truly the twin brother of the Sun King? Did he die in the Bastille, or did he walk free on a moonlit road in 1703? Or, and this is the possibility that still chills the blood of those who study the Bourbon line, was the wrong child crowned in 1643? Imagine it. Imagine that the midwives, in the chaos and blood of that September morning, lost track for one fatal minute. Imagine that the child smuggled away was the elder by 30 minutes, and the boy proclaimed Dauphin was in fact the younger. Imagine that the greatest monarch in French history was an impostor, and the true King of France spent his life behind a mask, watching his younger brother steal the sun. No wonder the Bourbons kept the secret. No wonder, even now, when the descendants of European royalty gather at weddings or funerals, someone will occasionally glance at a portrait of Louis XIV and feel a shiver they cannot explain. Because somewhere, in the shadows of history, a pair of dark eyes still watches, and somewhere, beneath centuries of lies, a heart still beats with the words, "I was first." The imposter theory is not the wildest version of the story. It is the darkest. It is the one that makes even the most cynical historians put down their wine and stare into the fire for a very long time. It begins with a single, almost innocent detail that no one noticed until the archives were catalogued in the 19th century. In the parish register of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, the entry for the royal birth on 5th September 1638 was written in 2 different inks. The first part, announcing the birth of Louis Dieudonné at 10 o'clock, is in the usual sepia gall ink. The second part, recording the second child at 10:30, is in a darker, almost black mixture, the sort made in haste with soot and vinegar when the ordinary ink runs out. Someone, in the minutes between the 2 births, changed pens, and someone, perhaps the same hand, later went back and added a tiny, almost invisible mark next to the first entry. A minute cross, no bigger than a pinprick, placed exactly where a clerk might note that a record has been corrected. The mark is still there. You can see it under ultraviolet light in the Archives Nationales in Paris, if you know where to look and have the right permissions. Most people never will. But in 1784, a young archivist named Pierre de Lille did. He was cataloguing the parish books in preparation for the coming Estates General, and he noticed the mark. He noticed something else too. The original baptismal robe preserved in the treasury of Saint-Germain, the one said to have been worn by the Dauphin, carries 2 sets of tiny blood spots. One set is bright, arterial red, the sort left by the umbilical cord of a firstborn. The other is darker, almost brown. The blood of a second child born after the placenta has begun to separate. De Lille wrote a private memoir that was never published in his lifetime. In it he asks a question that stops the breath. What if the midwives, exhausted and terrified, simply lost track of which child was which in the heap of bloodied linen? What if the child handed to the heralds on the balcony, the child proclaimed to France as the God-given, was in fact the younger twin, while the elder was the one carried away into the night? It is not impossible. Midwives in the 17th century did not have watches. They timed births by the chiming of the palace clock, and in the panic of a double delivery 30 minutes can blur into 3. The Queen was half fainting. The room was full of screaming women and priests waving crucifixes. No one was taking notes, and Richelieu was not in the birthing chamber. He arrived later, saw 2 identical infants, and made his decision based on what he was told, that the first cry had come at 10 o'clock. But what if the person who told him was wrong? The theory gains terrifying weight when you look at the lives of the 2 men. The king who ruled as Louis XIV was vain, theatrical, obsessed with being seen as unique, the only sun in the heavens. He built a palace of mirrors so that he could watch himself from every angle, as if to reassure himself that there was no double lurking in the glass. The prisoner, by every account that survived, was quiet, devout, almost saintly in his patience. Saint-Mars wrote, in a letter that somehow escaped the flames, that the masked man once said, "I was born to rule, but God chose otherwise." When asked what he would have done as king, the prisoner replied, "I would have forgiven my enemies and lived in peace." That does not sound like the Sun King. It sounds like the king France never had. There is physical evidence too, though it is gruesome. In 1703, when the official record claims the masked prisoner died, the body buried in the church of Saint-Paul-Saint-Louis was measured at 5 feet 8 inches, tall for the time, but noticeably shorter than Louis XIV, who stood nearly 6 feet 2 in his stockings, even in old age. The king's height was legendary. He wore red heels to make himself taller, yet the corpse in the Bastille ledger is recorded as of middling stature. The clerk even added in a marginal note, "shorter than expected." And then there is the strangest detail of all. In November 1715, 3 months after Louis XIV's death, a sealed coffin was quietly moved from the royal crypt at Saint-Denis. It was done at night, under the authority of the regent himself. The official reason given was repairs to the vault, but the workman who carried the coffin later swore it was unusually light, as if it contained no body at all, only ballast stones. At the same time, in the little church of St. Paul, the grave of the man officially known as Marchioli was opened for sanitary reasons and reburied deeper. No one has found it since. What if the coffin moved from Saint-Denis was empty, because the real Louis XIV, the younger twin, had died years earlier, and the man who ruled until 1715 was the elder, released from his mask in 1703 and quietly installed on the throne, while the younger, exhausted by 72 years of absolute power, was allowed to die in the shadows? It sounds insane. It probably is insane, but it explains why the Sun King in his final years grew obsessed with confession, why he ordered the destruction of certain palace mirrors, why he once stared for a long time at a portrait of himself as a child and whispered, "That is not me." It explains why, in the private chapel at Versailles, there is a small side altar no guidebook ever mentions. On it stands a single candle that has burned day and night since 1715. The candle is replaced every year on 5th September, the birthday no one officially celebrates, and it explains the last, most chilling piece of evidence, discovered only in 1932 when the attic of a ruined chateau in Provence was cleared after a fire. Among the ashes was a small iron box containing a single object, a black velvet mask stiffened with age, the steel plates inside rusted to the cloth. Locked to it, fused by centuries of damp, was a silver padlock. The key was still in the lock. It had been turned. The mask in the iron box was not the one from the legend. It was smaller, finer, almost delicate, the kind of thing a prince might have worn to a masquerade, not a brute instrument of punishment. But the rust inside the velvet was the colour of dried blood, and when the restorer at the Louvre finally dared to open the padlock in 1934, something fell out onto the felt table. A single lock of dark hair, still tied with a thread of faded gold. The thread was embroidered with tiny fleurs-de-lis. The discovery was immediately classified. The hair was taken to a laboratory in Lyon where a young scientist named Marie-Anne de la Trémoille, a distant cousin of the Orléans line who had no idea of her own blood's burden, performed the first mitochondrial comparison ever attempted on historical remains. She had only 2 other samples, a tooth from the exhumed coffin of Louis XIV at Saint-Denis, and a ribbon said to have been worn by the prisoner in the Bastille, preserved in the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal. The results were locked in a steel cabinet for 70 years. They were opened in 2004 by a judicial order after a lawsuit brought by a man claiming to be the last direct descendant of the masked prisoner through a secret marriage on the Ile Sainte-Marguerite. The claim was laughed out of court, but the DNA file was unsealed. The mitochondrial sequence from the hair in the mask did not match the tooth of Louis XIV. It matched the ribbon. The man buried as the Sun King was not the same man who had worn the mask. But he was the same maternal line. The 2 men were brothers. Full brothers, twins. The laboratory report ends with a note in the director's handwriting. Conclusion impossible without violating the laws of chronology as currently understood. Translation: one of the 2 men lived longer than history allows, and that is where the trail goes cold, or rather, where it doubles back on itself like a Mobius strip. Because there is one final document, discovered only 8 years ago in the attic of a Parisian notary's house, that had stood untouched since 1723. It is a single sheet of heavy vellum, folded so many times that it cracked along the creases when unfolded. The ink is iron gall, almost black, written in a hand that matches the margins of the Bastille prayer books. It is dated 19th of November 1703, the very day the prisoner supposedly died. The text is in French, but the last paragraph is in Latin, as if the writer no longer trusted his own language. I will translate it here, exactly as it appears. They have taken my name and given it to my shadow. They have taken my face and nailed it to a corpse. Tonight the mask comes off, and tomorrow the world will kneel to the wrong king. I forgive Louis because he never knew he was the younger. I forgive Anne because she was afraid. I do not forgive the throne. One day a child of my blood will sit upon it, and on that day France will remember who was born first. Until then, I vanish willingly. Pray for the soul of the man you called Marchioli. Pray harder for the soul of the man you called Le Roi Soleil. One of us is in the grave, the other walks free. Guess if you dare, which is which. At the bottom, instead of a signature, there is a drawing. 2 identical infant faces side by side. One is crowned with a tiny sun, the other wears a tiny mask. Beneath them, a single line. 4th September 1638. The day France crowned a changeling. The document has been carbon dated between 1695 and 1705. The vellum came from the Royal Chancery at Versailles. The ink contains particles of gold leaf, the same gold used in the illumination of Louis XIV's personal missal. No one knows how it left the palace. No one knows who hid it in the notary's attic. No one above all knows which twin wrote it. But every year on the night of 5th September, the candle on the hidden altar at Versailles burns a little lower, a little faster, as if something on the other side of the flame is breathing it in. and in the royal crypt at Saint-Denis, restorers have noticed something odd about the effigy of Louis XIV. The stone face, carved in 1715, is perfect in every detail, except one. The left ear is slightly higher than the right. It is a flaw no sculptor would make. It is the kind of tiny difference that only appears between identical twins. The candle still burns. In the 21st century, when Versailles is full of camera flashes and school children licking ice cream, the little side chapel remains locked. Only one guardian has the key now, an elderly woman from the Service des Monuments Historiques, who claims descent from the old palace laundresses. She enters alone at dusk every 5 September, replaces the candle with one she's made herself, beeswax mixed with lavender from the Queen's Hamlet, lights it with a wooden spill, and leaves without a word. She will not speak of what she sometimes sees in the flame, 2 silhouettes shoulder to shoulder, one in a sunburst of gold, the other in a shadow shaped like a mask. But the story has not stayed inside the chapel walls. In 2011, a maintenance worker doing routine checks in the attics above the Hall of Mirrors found a narrow void behind a false panel. Inside lay a child's wooden toy, a miniature coach, no longer than a man's hand, painted black, with real iron nails for wheels. The door of the coach opens. Inside is a tiny figure carved from boxwood, its face hidden by a speck of black velvet no bigger than a fingernail. Someone, centuries ago, had taken the trouble to glue a single thread of real silver wire to the back of the head as a padlock. The figure is jointed at the shoulders and hips. When you lift it, the arms fall forward in a gesture of perpetual prayer. The toy was photographed, catalogued, and then, despite protests from several curators, quietly moved to a locked drawer in the director's office. The official reason, too disturbing for public display. The worker who found it quit the next week. He told friends he had dreamed of a tall man in outdated clothes standing at the foot of his bed, lifting a finger to where his mouth should be. In 2017, a 17-year-old mathematics prodigy from Lyon named Camille de Rohan, yes, that Rohan, the family never quite lost its taste for secrets, published a paper that should have been impossible. Using terrestrial magnetism data from 17th century compasses and the precise alignment of certain windows at Versailles, she proved that on the morning of 5th September 1638, the shadow cast by the palace's western facade would have fallen across the birthing chamber in such a way that the first infant lifted toward the light would have appeared, for exactly 4 minutes, to be bathed in darkness, while the second, lying a few inches to the east, caught the first ray of sun, 4 minutes, long enough for exhausted eyes to believe they had seen the opposite of what happened. The paper was withdrawn from the university server within hours. Camille received a polite but firm invitation to study abroad. She now lives in Montreal and no longer answers questions about twins. Yet the loudest silence of all comes from the living Bourbons. There are still claimants. A quiet branch in Spain, a winemaker in Portugal, a Belgian banker who funds historical conferences but never speaks at them. Every few years, one of them applies for access to the sealed folder in the Archives Nationales. Every application is refused on the same grounds: risk to public order. In 2023, King Felipe VI of Spain, descended like all modern Bourbons from the younger son of Louis XIV, made an official visit to Versailles. During the gala dinner, he was seated beneath the great portrait of the Sun King in the Hall of Mirrors. At one point, he raised his glass to the painting and, in a voice clearly caught by the microphones, said softly in Spanish, "Primo mío, cuánto lo siento." My cousin, I am so sorry. The clip lasted 12 seconds online before it was removed for copyright violation. But 12 seconds was enough. Within hours, the phrase was trending across Europe, translated into a dozen languages, stamped on t-shirts, whispered in classrooms. The palace press office issued a statement that the king had been referring to the burdens of monarchy in general. No one believed them, and so we come full circle, back to the candle, back to the 2 infants crying in a blood-slicked chamber 387 years ago. One of them became the face on 1,000,000 coins, the builder of the most magnificent palace the world has ever seen, the man who declared "L'État, c'est moi," and made Europe tremble. The other became a rumour, a shadow, a toy coach hidden in an attic, a lock of hair in a rusted mask. Only one question still matters, and it is the question no one can ever answer with certainty. Which one was which? Perhaps it does not matter anymore. Perhaps in the end, France got the king she deserved, and the king got the brother he needed. One to wear the sun, the other to carry the darkness so the sun could shine. Or perhaps, on some quiet night when the tourists have gone and the lavender candle gutters in its silver sconce, the two of them stand together again in the chapel, no longer divided by velvet or iron, by crown or prison, by history or lies. Two old men in outmoded clothes, shoulder to shoulder, looking at last into each other's unmasked eyes. One reaches out and touches the flame, the candle goes out. And in the sudden darkness, a single voice, impossible to tell whose, whispers the words that have waited nearly 4 centuries to be spoken aloud. Brother, come home. The palace sleeps, but it does not forget. In the winter of 2024, during the great renovation of the North Wing, workers drilling behind a blocked-up fireplace in the old Queen's apartment struck something hollow. When the plaster was carefully cut away, a narrow cavity appeared, no larger than a confessional, and inside, wrapped in oilskin gone brittle as dead leaves, lay a small cedar box. Inside the box, a child's lace christening cap, yellowed but intact, a single dried lavender flower, a miniature portrait on ivory of Queen Anne of Austria, the paint cracked, but the eyes still luminous with sorrow, and on top a sheet of vellum folded into 8 perfect squares. The vellum bears no date, only a monogram in the top corner, 2 interlaced L's surmounted by a closed crown and an open mask. The text is written in a hand that every paleographer who has seen it, only 4 people under conditions of absolute secrecy, recognises instantly as the same hand that wrote the 1703 testament hidden in the notary's attic. It is the last testament of the man who was never allowed a name. I've seen a photograph of the letter. I'm not supposed to say how. This is what it says. To whichever of my blood finds this, know that I lived 81 years, 34 of them behind the mask, and 47 as a free man who was never free. After the night on the road to the west, Saint Mars kept his oath. He took me to a village in the mountains where no one asked questions. I became a schoolmaster to the children of charcoal burners. I taught them Latin and the catechism, and every evening I watched the sun set behind peaks that looked, from a distance, like the towers of a palace I was never meant to enter. I married a woman who loved the silence in me more than the story. We had 3 daughters and a son. They were told their father had been a soldier blinded in the war. They never saw me without the black silk bandage I wore across my eyes in daylight. At night, when the house slept, I removed it and looked at the moon with the same face that once looked down from 1,000,000 medals. My wife died in 1744. My children scattered. My son carried the secret to New France and vanished in the forests beyond Quebec. My eldest daughter married a stonemason in Lyon. Her blood still walks the earth, though she never knew it. I returned to Paris only once, in the year 1753. I was 75, bent, white-haired, invisible. I stood in the crowd when Louis XV rode past after his coronation. He was my great-nephew, though he never knew it. He had the Bourbon nose, the heavy eyelids, the slight asymmetry of the left ear. When he smiled at the cheering people, I smiled too because I recognised the expression. It was mine. I died on 5th of September 1759, exactly 121 years after I was born. They buried me under the name Etienne de Jonchet, schoolmaster, in a little churchyard that no longer exists. The church was demolished in 1890 to make way for the Boulevard Raspail. My bones lie somewhere beneath the asphalt between a pharmacy and a brasserie. Before I died, I came back to Versailles one final time. I bribed a gardener to let me into the palace after midnight. I walked the corridors alone, my stick tapping on the marble like a blind man's cane. In the Hall of Mirrors, I stopped beneath the great portrait of the king they called Le Grand. I took the black silk from my eyes and looked up at him. He looked down at me. For the first time in my life, I saw my own face painted 30 feet high, wearing a crown I'd never touched. I did not weep. I laughed, so quietly that even the moonlight did not hear. Then I came here, to the Queen, our mother's apartments, and I hid this box behind the chimney, where the builders would one day find it. I placed the christening cap that had been meant for me, the portrait of the woman who gave me life and took it away in the same hour, and this letter. Now you know, the throne was never the point. The throne was the price. The point was the choice, to let France tear itself apart over 2 identical boys, or to let one boy be torn apart so France could live. I made the choice for them. I chose the mask so that my brother could have the sun. Tell the world, or burn this letter, it does not matter. The candle in the chapel will go out either way. But if you are my blood, if the old asymmetry still runs in your ears and your heart still remembers a cry it never heard, then come some September evening when the tourists are gone, stand in the chapel, speak no prayers, simply say the name no one ever spoke, Philippe. Say it once, softly. I have been waiting a very long time to hear someone get it right. Your ancestor, your shadow, your king who might have been, the one who was born first. The letter ends there. The cedar box is now locked in the same steel cabinet that once held the mask hair and the DNA report. The French state has classified it for 100 years, but the elderly guardian still replaces the candle every 5 September. And some years, only some, when she strikes the match, the flame leaps higher than it should, as though someone on the other side of the air has been holding his breath for centuries and finally gently lets it go. The palace sleeps. But somewhere under the boulevards of Paris, somewhere beneath the lavender fields of Provence, somewhere in the blood of a child who will never know why she flinches when she sees the sun on the water, a heart that was never allowed to be royal keeps beating anyway. And on certain quiet nights, when the moon is full and the mirrors of Versailles are covered against the dust, you can almost hear it. A soft, steady sound, like a brother walking at last beside his brother, neither crowned nor masked, neither prisoner nor king. Just 2 boys from Saint-Germain, hand in hand, finally going home. And now, when the last tourist bus has rolled away from the gates of Versailles and the floodlights dim to a whisper, the palace does something it has never done in 3 centuries of public life. It exhales. You would have to be there at the right moment, around 3 in the morning when even the night guards are half dreaming, to notice it. The great windows seem to shiver. The mirrors fog for no reason. In the Queen's guardroom, the marble eyes of the busts turn a fraction of a degree, as though something long motionless has finally been allowed to move. On those nights, the elderly guardian no longer comes alone. She brings a child, always a different child, never the same one twice. Sometimes a boy, sometimes a girl, always between 8 and 10 years old. They are chosen quietly, carefully, from families whose genealogies carry certain quiet, unadvertised anomalies. A left ear set a millimetre higher, a birth on the 5th of September, a recurring dream of lavender and iron. She leads the child by the hand through the sleeping palace, past the sleeping guards who somehow never wake. They walk the entire length of the Hall of Mirrors without making a sound. At the far end, she opens a small, unmarked door that no official plan of Versailles has ever shown. A spiral staircase, narrow as a throat, descends into darkness that smells of candle smoke and centuries. At the bottom is a room no one has entered since 1789. It is perfectly round, 12 feet across, windowless. The walls are lined with black velvet that has never faded. In the centre stands a single object, a low ebony table on which rest 2 things. One is a crown, small, plain, the gold dulled by time. It is not the great diamond crown of France. It is the little circlet made for the infant Dauphin on the day he was christened Louis Dieudonné. It has never been worn. The other is a mask, black velvet, steel-lined, the silver padlock still intact. It too has never been worn again after that night on the moonlit road. Between them, on a square of faded blue ribbon, lies the tiny gold cross that Queen Anne pressed into the hand of the child she gave away. The guardian lifts the child so that he or she can see. She says only one sentence, the same every time. Choose. The child always understands. Some reach for the crown. Their fingers stop an inch away, trembling, then withdraw. Some reach for the mask. They touch the velvet gently, almost lovingly, then shake their heads. None has ever taken either. They simply look for a long time, then turn to the guardian and nod. She smiles, the first and only smile anyone has ever seen on her face, and leads them back up the spiral stair. By the time they reach the top, dawn is beginning to bleach the sky over the Grand Canal. The child is taken home before anyone notices they were gone. They will never speak of what they saw. They don't need to. Something in their eyes has changed forever. Years later, decades later, when those children have grown and had children of their own, they will sometimes wake in the night with the taste of lavender on their tongue and the feeling that someone, somewhere, has just whispered, "Thank you." The crown and the mask remain untouched. They are waiting, not for a king, not for a prisoner. They are waiting for the moment. No one knows when, no one knows how, when France, or the idea that was once France, is finally gentle enough that neither object is needed anymore. On that night, the guardian will not bring a child. She will come alone, carrying the cedar box from the chimney, the rusted mask from the attic, the lock of hair, the wooden toy coach, the cracked miniature portrait, every relic that has ever been found. She will lay them on the ebony table beside the crown and the mask. Then she will open the silver padlock with the key that was always there. She will place the little gold cross in the centre of the crown, and she will wait. Somewhere in the palace, every mirror will cloud at once. Somewhere in Paris, beneath the boulevard Raspail, bones that were never given a name will turn to dust and drift upward like golden smoke. Somewhere in the blood of every person who ever flinched at the sun on water, a heartbeat that began on 5th September 1638 will finally, quietly, stop. The guardian will lift the mask and the crown together. They will weigh nothing at all, and she will walk out through the hall of mirrors. The first light of morning will strike the chandeliers, and for one instant, every pendant of crystal will show the same reflection. Two old men in simple black coats, arm in arm, smiling like boys who have just been told they can go home. Then the mirrors will clear. The room at the bottom of the spiral stair will be empty. The guardian will lock the unmarked door for the last time and drop the key into the Grand Canal, where the carp, old, slow and golden, will swallow it without a ripple, and Versailles, after almost 400 years, will finally be allowed to forget. The candle in the chapel will not be lit again. The palace will sleep cleanly, like a house from which the last ghost has gently departed. And somewhere, very far away, perhaps in the mountains where a schoolmaster once taught charcoal burners children, perhaps across the sea where a soldier blinded by war vanished into the forest, two voices that have never spoken in unison will at last say the same words at the same moment in perfect silence. It is finished. Brother, thank you. And then there is nothing more to say. The palace wakes to another ordinary morning. Tourists queue at the golden gates. School children race across the parquet, laughing. The guides recite their polished stories about the Sun King and his wars and his mistresses, never noticing that the air feels lighter now, as if a hand that had rested on the throat of the building for centuries has finally lifted. The elderly guardian retires the following spring. She leaves no forwarding address. The keyring she once carried, heavy with iron keys to doors that no longer exist, is found on a hook in the staff cloakroom, tags blank, metal polished bright by nervous fingers that never quite dared to ask what any of them opened. In the little round room beneath the palace, the ebony table stands empty. Dust begins to settle where the crown and the mask once lay. It will take decades for the velvet on the walls to fade, centuries for the scent of old candle smoke to leave the stones. But the room is no longer waiting. It has become only a room. Years pass, then decades. One September evening in 2087, exactly 449 years after the morning everything changed, a small girl escapes her parents in the gardens of Versailles. She's 8 years old, dark-eyed, born on the 5th of September, left, ear very slightly higher than the right. She wanders through the Bosquet de la Reine, chasing a butterfly the colour of faded royal blue. Behind a hedge she finds a door she has never seen before, low, wooden, half hidden by ivy. It is unlocked. She pushes it open and steps into cool darkness that smells faintly of lavender and iron. Inside is the round room, exactly as it was, except now the black velvet has turned the soft grey of ash, and the ebony table is gone. In its place is a single circle of sunlight falling through a tiny oculus that was not there yesterday. In the middle of the circle lie two objects. One is a child's toy coach, freshly painted, wheels gleaming. The other is a little gold cross on a blue ribbon. The girl kneels. She does not know why she is crying. She picks up the cross and hangs it around her neck. Then she lifts the toy coach and turns it over in her small hands, wondering why it feels warm as though someone has only just set it down. High above her, in the palace, every clock strikes 6, though it is only 4:30. The sound rolls through the galleries like distant summer thunder. The girl stands, pockets the coach, and walks back out into the garden. The door closes behind her without a sound, and will never open again. She finds her parents. They scold her gently for wandering off. She smiles and says nothing about the room, or the cross now hidden beneath her t-shirt, or the way the butterfly lands on her shoulder and stays there all the way to the car park. That night, in a small apartment on the outskirts of Paris, she places the toy coach on her bedside table. Before she falls asleep, she whispers a single word she's never been taught, a word that tastes like candle smoke and forgiveness. Philippe. Somewhere very far away, or perhaps very close, two old voices answer together, soft as wind in lavender. "Good night, little sister. Sleep well. We are home at last." And for the first time since 1638, the Palace of Versailles dreams of nothing at all.